Free Will and Freedom. In the books on Catharism, we read that the Cathars denied free will. Dante instead affirms it. Let's clarify. Free will is still one of the great theological problems and one of the central knotty issues of philosophical speculations. It consists of the human faculty of choosing freely. From a religious point of view, one could specify between good and evil. On this freedom is based man's moral responsibility, with all that it implies, not only in the field of religion, but the civil too. The Cathars didn't deny that man has the ability to choose between good and evil, but they denied that such a faculty came from God, because if that were the case, evil in a certain way would have been permitted by God, something inadmissible in their eyes. They knew well that the possibility of committing evil is present in man, but they didn't consider it a freedom, but rather an enslavement. In the comedy, the discourse on free will is much more complex and intriguing than it seems at first glance. It is entrusted to Marco Lombardo in the central canto of the poem. Dante asks Marco to explain where evil arose, adding, "Did it arise perhaps from the influence of the stars?" "You who live," answers Marco, "always search for every reason in the heavens. But if everything was determined above, it would destroy free will, and there wouldn't be any," page 238, "justice in rewarding the good and punishing the evil." Evil arises in you, Marco concludes, because a light had been given to distinguish between good and evil, and free choice. Evil arises from man because, as Beatrice explains in her first fundamental discourse, in a universe in which all things have order among themselves, man is the only creature who has the power to turn to another place, and the other with respect to his nature, to his instinct, which is to ascend to God. It can be done because it is free. Virgil will also deal with the question. There is an instinct in man, a primal will, a primal desire, which is that of ascending to God. Now, that all other longings may conform to this first will, there is in you, inborn, a power that counsels, a keeper of the threshold of your ascent. This is the principle on which your merit may be judged, for it garners and winnows good and evil longings. Those reasoners who reach the roots of things, learned of this inborn freedom, the bequest that thus they left unto the world is ethics. Even if we allow necessity as source for every love that flames in you, the power to curb that love is still your own. This noble power is what Beatrice means by free will. Purgatory 18, 61-74. I wanted to include the whole passage because it is fundamental, not only respecting Catharism, but to know Dante's thinking. Free will is the faculty in man to choose between good and evil. It is a freedom, but take note, it is an inborn freedom, a word that appears twice, as I wanted to emphasize. Page 239. Elsewhere in the poem there are, however, two verses that create a problem. The first, most famous, is that in which, at the start of Purgatory, Virgil says of Dante, he goes in search of freedom. The other is that in which Dante, at the end of Paradise, says to Beatrice, "You have drawn me from slavery to freedom." Neither would make any sense if they referred to an inborn freedom. So then, it concerns two different freedoms, that inborn and free will, that is, the freedom to choose between good and evil. Of this function, one can argue that this is the fruit of the forbidden tree, that is, that it consists of that which the Catholic Church calls original sin. It's no coincidence that it is repeatedly called inborn. The freedom that Dante goes in search of is found instead beyond the cone of the shadow of the tree of good and evil, in the radiant sphere of the tree of life, and must be conquered. It is evident that free will is not true freedom. Dante finds true freedom when, guided by Beatrice, he comes to God. Then he will say something that must make us reflect. Whoever sees that light is soon made such that it would be impossible for him to set that light aside for other sight. Paradise 33, 100 to 102. It sounds like a constraint. Freedom would consist of the impossibility of desiring something else. It's paradoxical, but it is really so. From the beginning in paradise, the souls of the blessed have repeatedly said that the condition of blessedness consists of keeping oneself within the divine will. In the end, Dante also achieves such a condition, and in the last verses of the poem could say that his desire and his will are in absolute agreement with the will of God. It is not a case of renunciation. On the contrary, it's a case of realizing oneself, of becoming oneself. With an expression of shocking modernity, Dante says exactly this: God is the eternal pleasure through whose will each thing becomes the being that it is. This is the true, page 240, freedom. Becoming oneself, realizing one's own nature. Free will, on close inspection, consents instead to turn to another place, that is, to sin, to choose evil. Therefore, exactly as the Cathars understood, free will is not a freedom. It is slavery, a freedom from which one must free oneself. And it doesn't come from God, because it is the primal will that comes exclusively from God, the desire of ascending to Him.